Hi, this is Patrick Jackson with my Module 9 case study for AEP 855, Educational Leadership. In this case, we see two boys, James and David, who have been charged with possession of a banned weapon on school grounds. Me as the assistant principal, I'm in charge of investigating this situation where David has been bullied into possessing the weapons by James, who is a Southside student that comes from a pretty rough background, whereas David is more of an exemplary student who excels not only academically but also in the performing arts. Expulsion papers have only been filed for James in this situation as I advocate for David as a victim in the situation. And because of this, I face potential disciplinary measures for not filing expulsion papers against David per district policy. As we look at legal and ethical issues associated with this case, the first one that I look at is the relationship that I've been working to build with the Southside students of our building. The Southside is affiliated with maybe a rougher background where students need a little bit more attention to help them stay on track. I myself have been identified as being from the South Side, and having that affiliation, I've been putting a little bit more effort into trying to build those relationships to help those students out, spending extra time after school playing basketball with those students. And in doing so, I've built a relationship with James, who is apparently the leader of that group. Future circumstances for both students is another ethical issue we have to look at, as the expulsion of both students can affect their futures, particularly looking at David, who has not had any previous behavior issues and excels as a student. This could harm his future. Possession of prohibited weapon on school grounds is labeled as a felony in this case, therefore giving it some legal implications, as well as the Board of Education policy that has a zero tolerance stance on possession of weapons in school. What exactly has happened in the situation is that two students have committed a felony by possessing a prohibited weapon on school grounds, which by school board policy is a zero tolerance offense requiring immediate expulsion for 45 days. But one of the students in question has been bullied into possession of the weapon, creating an ethical dilemma for myself, for which I have to make a decision that could affect my future and the future of the two students. What we do know in this case are the people. We have James, who is a Southside student. He's a 15-year-old at this junior high, comes from a rougher background and has tattoos. I'm guessing that's probably a characteristic they throw in there to kind of depict his rough background. He is even said to have had, he's on his best streak of not getting in a fight. David, who is an exemplary student and excels in band and academically, has not had any behavior issues to this point. The school police officer has been pulled into this situation when asked to escort the students down to the office, who also reacts immediately to the situation and enforcing what he needs to do for his job and his policies. The students' mothers are also called upon in this case, whereas James's mother looks to teach James a lesson by allowing him to be sent to jail, whereas David's mother is very concerned and upset, where she views her son as a victim in this situation, wondering why we're not doing more to protect her son. The director of secondary education is also involved in this, as he's had to step in to inform me of the consequences that could come if I do not file expulsion papers for David, in that I could get an official reprimand put on my record as an administrator. This takes place at Rocket Junior High, which I would assume is an urban school, as the South Side is referenced, and must be a diverse population of different neighborhoods or different areas of the city are inhabiting a school. The program itself has approximately 900 students. It's a decently large school, and this district also has a disciplinary alternative education program for students who receive expulsion papers or being expelled for 45 days. I would assume this is a public school as they have a school police officer. And because it's a junior high, we can assume that it serves grades 6 through 9 or possibly 7 through 9, depending on the layout of the district. Prioritizing the information. We see David is an outstanding student, which is referred to early in this case, 13 years old and not having any behavior issues prior. Some other things to look at would be my relationship with the Southside student, James, who I've been working to build up our relationship. And he's also referred to as a leader, kind of as this group of Southside students and coming from a rough background. There's no mention of an investigation when the teacher reports that something's being handed off between these two students and referring that it could possibly be drug related, which has nothing to do with the case after a little bit of investigation. But there's really no investigation to be had after the story has been told, and both students are immediately arrested by the school police officer. And then if we look at following the district policy, there is enough evidence to make a decision, but that decision would be made purely based off of policy, not necessarily based on moral beliefs or what's best for the students. Coming up with my options and figuring out the best way to solve this case or work this case out would be the first option, taking no action, doing exactly what's stated in the case, following through with the expulsion process per the district policy to model ethical behavior, or what most would consider ethical by following the policy. Both students would be served their expulsion papers, and both students would receive the consequence that aligns with their actions. The second option would be to stick to my guns and advocating for David and taking the official reprimand by not filing the expulsion papers, where I view David as the victim and don't believe that he should be expelled the same way James is. And then my third option is more of a question, but what if school police officer was not involved and a more thorough investigation had taken place? Would the outcome be the same for David? Evaluating my options. First option, taking no action. The pros in this situation would be following policy, ensuring consistency and eliminating favoritism. If I follow through this way, both students would end up getting their expulsion papers by following that district policy that demands that. I would avoid my official reprimand by doing so. And again, in many cases or many people's eyes, this would be considered modeling ethical behavior on my part. But the cons of this situation would be that damaging David's image or potential future by giving him this label, also damaging the relationship with families, David's family in particular, by not advocating for him, and also damaging my relationship with James, which I've worked really hard to build. My second option, sticking to my guns. Pros would include advocating for David again, building that relationship with that family, but furthermore modeling relational capacity with students and families by taking time to actually advocate for that student and make sure that the best outcome happens for him. Unfortunately, the cons in this one would be I would get that official reprimand on my record. I would be modeling unethical decision-making for staff and other stakeholders such as students. For staff, I'm showing them that you don't have to follow policy when you're making decisions, which could be a slippery slope for me as an administrator dealing with other problems later down the road, as well as showing students that there's a chance they can get away with those kind of actions if they have the correct alibi. Inadvertently promoting the possession of prohibited weapons, which is relevant to this case itself. My last option would be an alternative investigation where we see what would happen if I did the investigation without getting the school police officer involved. In this situation, the pros would include evidence could have been gathered without an immediate arrest. I could have taken more time to figure out what the exact story was. Both students could have been better protected and better served. My relationship with James could be maybe upheld a little bit better. And a more subjective interpretation of policy by myself could have taken place, whereas the cons would include an immediate response would be less likely, as the investigation may take a little bit more time looking into all the evidence and possibly pulling other witnesses to get other statements. Students may have been less cooperative without the involvement of the school police officer, and this also could give those students a chance to either work together to align their story and help themselves, whereas it could put me in a situation where I end up making the wrong decision. And on the reverse side of that, it could also, for lack of better terms, give those students a chance to throw each other under the bus and go at each other rather than trying to solve the problem. I picked the alternative investigation as my best option. I believe that more ethical decisions could have been made that sought the best solution for both students, that also fall within board policy, where both students are not necessarily having to be arrested immediately as soon as we hear the case, but we can actually look into finding evidence that would support that in David's situation, he was coerced into holding those prohibited weapons. Looking at him as a victim could change the outcome and consequences that he would serve if he had any. And it's less likely that if I took that action, I would also receive an official reprimand by the director of secondary schools. Implementation of my idea of looking into an alternative investigation. First, I would start with giving due process to both students and hearing their stories, allowing them to give their own complete statement, and then seeing where the two statements aligned and where they didn't align. I could treat each student as individual cases in this situation and find which board policy is relative to their own individual case. In this situation, policy could still be upheld, but it may look a little different in David's case, rather than him just falling under possession of prohibited weapons. In this situation, it also could validate my pride in James when he stood up to take responsibility for his actions and stood up for David to ensure that David did not receive consequences. By separating the two individual cases, that could give James a little bit more validation, help uphold our relationship. In this situation, if I chose this plan, I would also request students from class without the police officer to do my questioning. This would allow each student to make an individual report that I could compare and hopefully find the discrepancies in their stories. I would then be able to look at their stories and find which district policies are relative to the situation, identify what legal statutes are relative to their situation, and inquire into the previous cases, possibly with similar characteristics and outcomes, could be gleaned from looking at past situations that were similar. In this situation, I could also rely on the expertise of others, questioning other administrators, mentors and teachers in the building that possibly have dealt with similar situations to try to figure out a best situation for both students and a best outcome, not only for both students, but myself, to avoid that official reprimand. In reflection of this case, following district school policy is one part of modeling ethical decision making, but it's not the whole of it. There's also taking into account your own values that you have to uphold. And when we look at developing our own moral compass, where do we draw that line with what's okay and what's not, what's acceptable and what's not? Looking at this case, I see a very clear-cut line that allowing a student to be expelled in a situation where they were being bullied, a line has to be drawn to uphold and advocate for that student to seek justice. Seeking balance that promotes the best outcome for all parties involved falls on that responsibility piece. As a professional, as an educator, we are responsible for promoting what is best for those students and not just finding the quickest way to solve our problems, but taking the time to actually figure out what's going to be the best outcome for both students, even if that outcome becomes a consequence to help the student learn and hopefully make better choices. And then furthermore, having integrity by following through, making sure that if I'm building relationship with students, I'm actually showing them that my actions reflect what I'm telling them. And that also goes back to that modeling ethical behavior piece, in which case if I'm going to be say something or promote something, I also have to follow through to make sure that my actions are showing that that's what I think.